This week we'll focus on joy and metaphor, while we continue our conversation about what moves us to write. What, out of all that stirs inside of us, is worthy of developing artistically for an eventual audience? In other words, we'll continue to look at what Stanislavski called the most effective kind of lures. By experimenting in this way, we'll collect material. From that material, we can decide on what's worth developing. Once we've done that, we'll start to focus in on some particular tools. For now, we're looking at how artists find inspiration, how writers get words on the page. Don't worry too much about how it comes out. My advice is just this. Don't try and sound like a dictionary or an encyclopedia or someone else, unless doing so is a creative choice versus trying to sound smart like you might think you need to for a school paper. In fact, for the length of the entire course, I highly encourage you to write in a style that sounds like you and or people that you know. Don't forget, knowing someone doesn't mean that you, the writer, are anything like that person. I'll give you an example. You may remember me saying that my parents moved from San Jose, California, to a small town in Massachusetts in the early 80s when I was 10 years old. Because I was new and because people there perceived me as feminine, I was bullied. I don't consider myself a bully, nor do I, as you can hear from listening to me, have a Massachusetts accent. But believe me when I tell you that I can write convincingly and artistically from the point of view of a playground bully with a Massachusetts accent, even if I, Matthew, the person, the writer, am nothing like that character in my story or play or in the voice of my poem. The great poet June Jordan encouraged her students, and I was one of them for a while, to write in what she called our first languages. She told me that my first language is how I define it. Her class was taught in English, but she told us if we had access to another or an additional language or style of speaking English, to feel free to use it. She encouraged us to think of what she called Black English, or patois, or Spanglish, or mixed Mandarin, or Spanish, or gay English, or slang as our first languages. She encouraged us to consider whom we were writing for, perhaps a younger version of ourselves, or for a community we belonged. I get goosebumps thinking about that day. She gave me permission to get free. Please do not feel like you need to sound like an encyclopedia around here. If you have access to a particular slang or a second or third or fourth language, if your grandparents pronounce words differently than your parents or than you, use all of it as you see fit. Do not try and write in a way that is appropriate. We're not writing rigid college essays here. We're making art. So goals for today. We're going to deepen our stories or poems or plays by looking for beauty in its opposite, as well as the edge in what we see as beautiful. We're going to examine metaphor and theme and symbol. We're going to look at what it's capable of and what it's not, and how it might work best for us. We're going to deepen our understanding of character in playwriting or fiction or the voice in our poems. And we're going to gain awareness of how our ideas, no matter how seemingly unoriginal in an early draft, can be layered to reveal the complexities of our characters. Most of this you're going to be doing by osmosis. I'm not going to go deeply into all of those definitions today, but they're there, believe me. Before we go into the warm-up, I want to remind us all that in art, things don't need to be portrayed as they seem. In fact, if you have access to what Teja Kuhl described as a truth that sheds a sideways light or contradicts the way that something is normally portrayed, you have more, not less, to give your eventual audience. Devastating scenes can be rendered beautifully. Spiritual writers have, since the beginning of recorded history, written beautifully about death and what is noble about pain or suffering. Do I, Matthew, think that suffering is noble? Me, mostly no. As with everything, it depends. If a politician or the owner of a corporation I work for is using words to try to convince me that suffering is noble, then I will automatically question it, because patriarchy and corporations are two constructs that rely heavily on people believing the idea that suffering or hard labor is virtuous. Horrible bosses and so-called leaders have used this notion to stay rich off of others' labors. But, on the other hand, if a poet talks about how she has found value in part of her own suffering, then I'm open. In either case, paying attention to language is key and helps me rethink my perception of society, where I see myself in it, my loved ones, and even my enemies. Writers very often unearth the underbelly of what is often asserted by the mainstream as beautiful. There are hundreds, thousands of poems, plays, short stories, for example, that dig under the surface of a family holiday. On the surface, people are gathered to celebrate and enjoy each other, right? The reality? It might be an emotional bloodbath. Okay, so enough of the preamble. Soon we'll warm up.